Good morning, and I'm pleased to welcome Mark Goldstein, the Director of Physical Infrastructure Issues at the General Accounting Office, or GAO, here this morning. Mr. Goldstein has been a frequent participant in this subcommittee's hearings over the years, providing valuable testimony on a wide range of infrastructure and similar issues. This hearing has been scheduled because the GAO alerted the subcommittee to serious preliminary findings concerning the condition of the Federal Protective Service, which is charged with providing security and public safety protection to 1 million federal employees. The GAO has concluded that FPS has deteriorated so substantially that difficulties, and here I'm quoting, may expose federal facilities to greater risk of crime or terrorist attack, end quote. The GAO backs up this conclusion with documentation, much of which we found shocking. Pardon me. The subcommittee believed, therefore, that the preliminary report should be placed on the record at a public hearing. In considering what the GAO has reported, we had to be mindful that federal facilities where federal employees work, particularly the Pentagon and the Oklahoma City Federal Building, have been major sites for terrorist attacks in this country. One of the 9/11 planes struck the Pentagon that became part of the worst terrorist disaster in our history. Federal facilities are symbols of the government that the terrorists want to bring down. We cannot forget that in addition to federal employees, millions of Americans frequent federal facilities and depend on the FPS for protection against crime as well as terrorism. Security officials report that federal buildings remain targets today. The documented history of terrorist assaults on federal assets and the continuing threat requires high levels of vigilance to protect employees and visitors. The Congress that has understood the need for bolstering police protection provided in the Capitol complex by the Capitol Police would not want to underestimate the importance of attention to other federal employees. Nearly a year ago, on February 13th, 2007, Chairman Jim Oberstar and I sent a letter to GAO asking that GAO review how the scope and mission of the FPS had been affected since its transfer from the General Services Administration, or GSA, to the Department of Homeland Security, DHS. In addition, we asked the GAO to review the Federal Protective Service budget and FTE levels to determine if they were adequate to support the newly transformed FPS, which has been converted to become an inspector-based workforce instead of the protection or police agency it was when it was absorbed into DHS. Both Chairman Oberstar and Ranking Member Micah have expressed their concerns about the gravity of the changes and the wisdom of pursuing the radically new policy of replacing protection with inspection. We asked for a comparison of experience, workforce size, retention rates, salaries, and other issues from the time when FPS was within GSA to now, when the agency is located within DHS. We were looking for a before and after comparison. The chairman and I raised serious concerns regarding whether the effectiveness of the FPS has been compromised since its placement inside the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. Even earlier, 2 years ago, On February 11th, 2005, we wrote to the DHS Inspector General regarding the use of funds transferred by GSA to DHS to support the FPS, the Federal Protective Service. We wanted to ensure that DHS was in compliance with the Homeland Security Act that requires that any GSA rents and fees transferred to DHS be used solely for the protection of buildings and grounds owned or occupied by the federal government. The IG determined that there was no particular violation of the Act then, but that the potential for violation existed, and recommended that DHS and ICE identify a source of funds for FPS administrative costs. To the best of our knowledge, this recommendation has not been acted upon either by ICE or DHS. Later that year, in June 2005, we wrote again because of increasing evidence that the placement of FPS within the ICE division had negatively affected the institutional integrity and law enforcement mission of the FPS. We were concerned that the separate funding source for FPS and its regional office command structure and mission were not aligned coherently with the ICE structure. We expressed our concern that the department was not realizing the cooperation and potential savings expected after the creation of DHS and the placement of the Federal Protective Service in DHS. Yet another indication of our workforce concern was expressed in our letter to the Appropriations Committee on November 2nd, 2007, requesting that a minimum number of 1,200 FPS employees be required. This language was included in the appropriations. Most recently, at a hearing on April 18, 2007, the subcommittee examined a particularly troubling FPS proposal to drastically reduce FPS officers across the nation, including providing no FPS officers in almost 50 cities. The Deputy Secretary of DHS, then at the time, Michael Jackson, indicated in response to questions that he would pursue memoranda of understandings, or MOUs, with these jurisdictions to make up for the absence of federal police officers. In fact, in staff briefings, DHS claimed to have in the works about 31 MOUs with city and local agencies. The FY 208 FPS budget called for no FPS officers in certain cities and said that, quote, local police support, end quote, was expected to act as a, quote, backstop, end quote, for securing federal facilities. At the time, I noted my concern that local police jurisdictions have little reason to volunteer to assume unfunded mandates to protect federal sites, particularly at the same time that local police departments were facing cuts in federal programs to aid police departments. Today, it is fair to ask, with whom have the MOUs been signed? What incentives have been identified for local police jurisdictions to take on the added burden of protecting federal facilities, in addition to their responsibilities for local law enforcement? We must ask as well whether we are seeing a slow disintegration of a workforce that has had a reputation as a highly effective and motivated police force, providing a valuable service to the federal government and its taxpayers. Are we witnessing the same disintegration of the FPS that occurred when FEMA was no longer an independent agency, but became a part of DHS. Congress cannot afford to wait for an FPS debacle patterned on the decline and fall of FEMA. A primary lesson from the Katrina tragedy, which shook DHS to its core, was unprofessional staffing. We hold this hearing today to help us learn from our history and not to repeat it. I thank the GAO for preparing testimony today, and again welcome Mr. Goldstein and his colleagues. The ranking member regrets that he could not be here this morning. He has indicated he would want to submit a statement for the record, so ordered. Mr. Goldstein, we'll prepare to receive your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We are pleased to be here today to discuss the efforts of the Federal Protective Service in protecting federal employees, the public, and federal facilities. As you know, in 2003, FPS was transferred from the General Services Administration to the Department of Homeland Security and is currently tasked with providing physical security and law enforcement services to about 8,800 facilities owned or leased by GSA. Within DHS, FPS is part of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Component, ICE, the largest investigative arm of DHS. To accomplish its facility protection mission, FPS currently has a workforce of about 1,100 employees and about 15,000 contract guards located throughout the country. While there has not been a large-scale attack on a domestic federal facility since the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, and the 1995 terrorist attack on the Oklahoma City Federal Building, it is important that FPS have sufficient resources and an effective approach to protect the over 1 million employees of the federal government, as well as members of the public that work in and visit federal facilities from the risk of terrorist attack, crime, and related activities. This testimony provides preliminary information and analysis on, 1, the extent to which FPS is fulfilling its mission to protect federal employees and facilities, and 2, the management challenges that FPS faces. It is based on the preliminary results of our ongoing review of FPS, which we are doing at the request of this subcommittee and several other congressional committees. To determine the extent to which FPS is fulfilling its facility protection mission and to identify the management challenges it faces, we analyzed FPS staffing data, and we interviewed FPS officers, inspectors, and administrators at headquarters and at 6 of FPS's 11 regions. So far in our work, we have interviewed more than 200 FPS employees. We also interviewed GSA, tenant agencies, and local police departments about FPS's efforts to protect federal employees, facilities, and the public. Due to the sensitivity of some of the information in this report, we cannot provide information about the specific locations of crime or other incidents that we discuss. My testimony makes the following points. Number 1, first, due to staffing and operational issues, FPS is experiencing significant difficulties in fully meeting its mission. According to many FPS officials at regions we visited, these difficulties may expose federal facilities to a greater risk of crime or terrorist attack. FPS's workforce, including both operational and support personnel, has decreased by about 20% from almost 1,400 in fiscal year 2004 to about 1,100 at the end of fiscal year 2007. In fiscal year 2007, FPS had 756 inspectors and police officers responsible for law enforcement and about 15,000 contract guards who are used primarily to monitor facilities through fixed post assignments and access control. FPS is also implementing a policy to change the composition of its workforce, as you mentioned, Madam Chair, whereby it will essentially eliminate the police officer position and mainly utilize inspectors, which have both physical security training and federal law enforcement authority. According to FPS officials, this policy change will allow it to address long-standing challenges such as funding and to help ensure that it has the right mix of staff to carry out its facility protection mission. One consequence of this change is that in many federal facilities, FPS is not providing proactive patrol in and around federal facilities in order to detect and prevent criminal incidents and terrorism-related activities before they occur. For example, at one location we visited, a deceased individual had been found in a vacant GSA facility that was not regularly patrolled by FPS. The deceased individual had been inside the building for approximately 3 months before the individual was found, and FPS did not find that individual. GSA found that individual. In addition, reports issued by multiple government entities acknowledge the importance of proactive patrol in detecting and deterring terrorist surveillance teams, which frequently use information such as the placement of armed guards in proximity to law enforcement agency stations when choosing targets and planning attacks. These sophisticated surveillance and research techniques can potentially be derailed by active law enforcement patrols in and around federal facilities. Indeed, FPS has recently arrested individuals surveilling major government facilities. We note that FPS has also reduced its hours of operation in many locations and has not always maintained security countermeasures and equipment, such as security cameras, magnetometers, X-ray machines, radios, and building security assessment equipment at some facilities we visited, undermining the protection of property and the deterrence of crime. Second, FPS continues to face several management challenges that many FPS officials say have hampered its ability to achieve its mission and increase the risk of criminal and terrorist activities on federal employees, facilities, and members of the public. These include budgetary challenges, a lack of adequate contract guard oversight, and the absence of agreements with local police departments regarding response capabilities or jurisdictional issues at federal facilities. Historically and recently, FPS revenues have not been sufficient to cover its operating costs. This revenue shortfall has been addressed in a variety of ways. For example, when FPS was located at GSA, it received additional funding from the Federal Buildings Fund. These funds were not available after FPS was transferred to DHS, which caused FPS to experience a revenue shortfall and to subsequently implement cost-saving measures, as well as increase security fees charged to tenants. For example, in fiscal year 2005, FPS faced a projected revenue shortfall of $70 million and instituted cost-saving measures that included restricted hiring and travel, limited training and overtime, and no employee performance awards. These measures have had a negative effect on staff morale and are partially responsible for FPS's high attrition rates and could potentially impact the performance and safety of FPS personnel. Moreover, many FPS officials at regions we visited expressed concern about the adequacy of contract guard oversight and poor performance by some guards when responding to crime and incidents at federal facilities. For instance, more than 20 handguns were stolen out of one federal building with the assistance of a contract guard, and a law enforcement surveillance trailer worth $500,000 was stolen from a federal parking lot, while guards watching through video cameras appear to have done nothing to stop the theft or even report it. FPS has stated before this committee and elsewhere that it is covering facility protection gaps through increased reliance on local law enforcement. However, FPS acknowledged to us that it has not signed any agreements with local law enforcement agencies to ensure local assistance or to resolve jurisdictional issues, which could authorize local police to respond to incidents at federal facilities. Also, local law enforcement officials in most of the cities that we visited said that, regardless of FPS's intentions, they do not have the capacity to respond to calls for service at federal facilities and would not sign agreements that require them to take on additional responsibility. Moreover, officials at multiple local police departments said they were not aware of FPS's operational challenges or expected reliance on their services. As stated, our results are preliminary. We plan to provide the subcommittee with our complete evaluation and a final report on FPS's facility protection efforts in May 2008. We plan to begin our review of FPS's contract guard program as requested by this subcommittee and other congressional committees in the near future. Finally, I want to recognize the assistance of the Federal Protective Service and its director, who were extremely helpful to GAO in setting up dozens of interviews that allowed us to meet more than 200 police officers and inspectors who every day defy obstacles to protect the property and people of the federal government. This concludes our testimony, and we're pleased to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goldstein. Some of that testimony is pretty hair-raising. It inclines us inclines me to want to know how common, whether you think the conditions you found, perhaps you should elaborate on the percentage of facilities you have been able to visit so far, and whether you think these are national concerns. I'd be interested in your view of the state of the Federal Protective Service in the National Capital Region, where about half of the federal presence is located as well. But first, nationwide, how typical, then National Capital Region?
Sure, I'd be happy to respond. It's not possible for us to say that this is universal based on our visits, of course, but I must say that in every region and in every city and every place that we visited, these concerns were raised, and the examples I've talked about are just a few. I would briefly provide a couple more for you.
If you
for the
would.
record. Regarding issues of response time. There was a suicide in a federal building, but FPS first had to ask for overtime authorization before they could respond to the event.
Now, would you elaborate on that? There was a suicide. It occurred during working hours, after working hours?
It was basically at closing time, is our understanding, and the Federal Protective Service these days only tends to work regular business hours during the week. There are no...
You're telling me if there's an emergency of some kind, that somebody has to give a police officer permission to use overtime to go to the
Yes,
emergency, or he's supposed to go home?
The mega center or some other FPS officer must first ensure that there's an overtime authorization if those individuals have already worked their hours. That's correct.
And
it affects response time.
Is it your understanding that federal police officers who are the equivalent of police officers in a city, they're peace officers, had to have permission, overtime permission, in order to answer such calls in the past?
Just in recent years, in previous years when there was more sufficient budget and when there were more officers, this was not an issue. But we've heard about this kind of an issue in many places. It's occurred with respect to demonstrations, where there were public demonstrations at federal facilities that were going on longer than anticipated. Officers who were supposed to leave because their shift was over were instructed to leave. Authorization had to first be obtained before they could remain any longer. Yes, this is very much an issue.
So suppose there's an emergency, particularly given what you describe as a diminishing workforce. Suppose there's an emergency and there's no overtime authorization. What is the peace officer supposed to do, the Federal Protective Service officer supposed to do in the event of an emergency?
The likelihood is there would not be an officer present.
What?
The likelihood is there would not be an officer present at that point. In most facilities, particularly evenings and weekends, there are no federal officers present. And generally, because of the reduction in the number of officers generally, FPS officers have to often travel great distances to oversee the buildings that they're responsible for and to oversee the contract guards they have, as much as 5 hours away. Responses can be hours late, they can be days late. In many instances, FPS officers and inspectors live in adjoining states to the buildings that they are responsible for if they have a large area.
Are there facilities where only security guards are available and they'd have to call a peace officer or a Federal Protective Service officer in order for the security guard to essentially...
Yes, ma'am, all the time.
So there are facilities where there are only security guards?
That's correct.
Would you describe what is
there are 8,800 federal buildings and only 216 federal police officers, 570 odd inspectors. So yes, there are absolutely many federal buildings without any officer present on a regular basis. They need to come from either adjacent buildings or often farther away. As our testimony indicates, there was an example recently in which an inspector retired some 6 months ago. His 70 facilities have yet to be reassigned, and so the contract guards in those 70 buildings are without any supervision.
Now, would you describe what the authority of a security guard is? If a security guard sees a crime, if a security guard has an emergency, what is the difference between what the security guard can do and what the FPS officer can do?
Sure. Most contract guards are very limited in their responsibilities. They can monitor facilities, mostly through fixed post assignments. There are a few roving assignments, but most are fixed posts. They mainly cover access to a building.
Does that mean that security guards do not patrol?
That's correct. There is very limited. There are some limited perimeter patrols, but it's quite limited. Mostly it's fixed patrol. Often they may stand right outside a major entryway to observe, but for the most part, they do not have any capability to patrol a perimeter and to be proactive in trying to determine threats to a facility.
So if there were only security guards present at a particular facility, does that mean there would be no proactive patrolling whatsoever going on?
That's correct. If FPS follows through on their program to essentially reduce and eliminate the patrol officer on the function of the proactive patrol.
Well, you say they, excuse me, you say they have been eliminated.
It's been principally eliminated in almost all places already, for all intents and purposes.
So where they have been eliminated, where there is not an FPS officer on duty, then there is no proactive patrolling whatsoever.
Yes, ma'am.
And that would be what percentage of buildings do you think in the United States?
I don't know the actual number, but it's virtually all.
Would you give an idea of what kind of buildings that the FPS, the universe of buildings, you know, the cross-section of buildings where FPS officers would generally have been assigned?
Most of the facilities that FPS would still be using for proactive patrolling would be the highest level, what they deem the highest level threats, what are called level 4 buildings, where you have the most number of federal employees, the most number of people in the public coming in and out, agencies of the government that are sort of more sensitive than others, like law enforcement agencies, that sort of a thing, and major urban areas. That's where you would find any remnants of proactive patrol occurring.
Mm-hmm. What is the proportion of inspectors to Federal Protective Service?
To police officers?
Police officers.
There are, and I have that figure, there are currently 541 inspectors and 215 officers as of the end of fiscal 2006.
513?
541 inspectors, 215 officers.
541 inspectors. Now, these inspectors are all federal protective, are all police officers as well?
Yes, ma'am. But their duties are much greater.
Were these people doing police work before the inspector notion entered the equation?
Yes, they were.
So that means we have 541.
And they still do some police work, but
what do they do that's still police? What proportion of their work is? First of all, I'm going to, at some point, perhaps after this question, I'm going to ask you to describe what an inspector who was from the Federal Protective Service does. But how much of the work of the inspector, since the inspector is an officer, what proportion of the work is inspection and what proportion is normal or traditional police work?
I can answer both this question and the next one, and probably together. I think it would be helpful to you. Inspectors have the following responsibilities. They have to oversee the contract guards. They have to do the building security assessments for all the buildings that they're responsible for. They are the contracting officer technical representatives for all of the contract guard programs. They do have law enforcement response. They have to handle criminal investigations. They collect contract guard time cards, and they're the folks who also work with the building security committees, which are the groups of tenants inside buildings who help make decisions about security arrangements. And most of the time and they're also the canine officers in many instances as well, handling the dogs that do bomb sniffing and the like. But most of their time is spent doing building security assessments and handling, increasingly, their roles as contracting officer technical representatives, which used to be a separate function, but that function no longer exists, and now it's the responsibility.
Yeah, well, that sounds like an administrative function, some of it.
It is, ma'am. So
these peace officers are doing mostly administrative work?
Both the officers and the inspectors in the field had very serious concerns about the role of the inspector to be able to get out into the field and to assist as backup or to assist in emergencies and to do anything other than, frankly, do a lot of paperwork behind their desk. And that was raised in multiple interviews that we had.
Well, I'm having a hard time understanding what an inspector does. You go around inspecting for what?
Their principal responsibility is for the building security assessments. They all, within their purview, have to do, on a regular basis, review the security issues within the buildings they have. So if an inspector has 70 buildings or 100 buildings, they're responsible for going to those buildings and doing an in-depth review on a regular basis. It's depending on the level of the building, there's a requirement that that building be reassessed on either 1 year or 4 year period. It's a pretty regular cycle. But these are relatively difficult to do because they're involving a lot of different parameters in terms of understanding countermeasures, lighting, posts, and and the kinds of threats that occur at these buildings. One of the concerns we've heard is that because of the overwhelming responsibilities now being pushed on to these inspectors, that both the quality of the building security assessments and the time that they are taking to complete them have been impacted. And I know of at least one agency that has actually gone out and asked the Army Corps of Engineers to redo their building security assessments because they were not happy with the assessment done by the Federal Protective Service.
If they're looking to make sure that the security, the building is secured, I note in your testimony, I'm quoting from your testimony, has not always maintained security countermeasures and equipment, such as security cameras, magnometers, X-ray machines, radios, and building security assessment equipment. Now, if you're not going to have proactive patrolling, you would think at the very least these inspectors would make sure that all the cameras are working and all the radios and other alternative security devices, alternative to perhaps some patrolling, would be in place. What kind of, you say have not always maintained these? Did you find that these cameras and other devices were often not working, or were they in working order most of the time?
We found in a number of instances that some measure of these countermeasures were not working. We found at one very large federal building that of 150 cameras, only 11 of them had the capability to record. We found in another very large federal building.
Wait a minute, 150 cameras throughout the building?
That's correct.
And 11 were
in fully functioning working order at one of the largest federal buildings in the United States.
What would have been the reason for that, Mr. Goldstein? Would it have been inspection? Would it have been lack of funding?
Principally a lack of funding, according to FPS, to fix them.
So FPS has reduced patrols, and what might be at least some kind of helpful alternative, which is at least have cameras throughout the building, also don't work in many instances. Is that your testimony?
Yes, ma'am. We found in another very large federal building that while they had some cameras in place, they had decided it was not a sufficient number, and they ordered a lot more cameras, and those cameras had, until very recently, been sitting in boxes for 5 years because there were not the funds to finish the enhancement program.
They were sitting in boxes for 5 years for what reason?
Because there were not funds to complete the program.
Well, you mean they were delivered?
They were delivered and not installed.
Well, there weren't the funds to get them installed?
That's what we understand, yes.
Because you have to have somebody who knows how to install them to do it, and you have to pay them?
And fix and connect them to the rest of the system and ensure that they work. And they were sitting in boxes for a number of years. I might add, if I may, ma'am, that in many instances, the absence of these kinds of countermeasures, like cameras, have prevented the FPS from investigating crime on federal property. There are a number of places where crimes have occurred. Laptops are frequently being stolen out of federal buildings. There is one federal building where 2 42-inch plasma television screens were removed from a federal building. And I mentioned the incident earlier with the guns, the handguns that were taken. it was very difficult in many instances, and in some impossible, for FPS to investigate these crimes because there were no cameras working that recorded the thefts.
If FPS is reducing its workforce, does it mean that it is no longer recruiting officers?
It is, we were told in many of the regions we went to that they have not been replacing people. They have not, they're not replacing people. I mentioned, for instance, the inspector who was retired some 6 months ago, and his 70 buildings have been just sitting out there for the last 6 months with no real oversight. They are not replacing people. We've heard that all over the agency. And there's an incredible amount of turnover. Here in the National Capital Region, there have been, in the last roughly 16 months, there have been 5 directors, regional directors of the National Capital Region.
5 regional directors within the last how many months?
Roughly 14 months, 14, 15 months.
So, well, let me ask you this. A federal police officer who has had training, where are federal police officers trained?
They are, well, recently the FPS has had no money for training, so they have not been trained except for very basic kinds of things, and they have had no money to travel, so they have done it right in their own offices.
Well, so when's the last time there was a recruiting class?
I'm not certain of that. I will provide that for the record.
As people retire, they are not being replaced?
That's correct. And when it comes to the police officer...
Go ahead.
When it comes to the police officer corps, they are, in many instances, we heard many stories that they have been actively ushered out, where the agency is encouraging them. There are high-level agency executives who have said, there is no future for you. We are getting rid of the police force. If you...
We are what?
There is no future for you. We're getting rid of the police force. If you plan to stay at FPS, you must become an inspector. Otherwise, you should leave.
So your testimony is that you believe the intention of DHS, the security agency, the place to which the Federal Protective Force was transferred in order to enhance security of federal agencies, intends to not only reduce but eliminate the police force that was to be the security force.
They plan to transform it into this inspector-based approach and, yes, eliminate police officers per se.
The fact that inspectors have police power is like saying that a line officer in a police department who sits at a desk has a police power. Yes, but he's not expected to go out and patrol. He doesn't do duty, and he's there to be an administrator. His police, certainly his police background is important for his work. But of course, people who work in these buildings believe they're being protected by people who are police officers. Let me, the vacant facility, the vacant GSA facility, not regularly patrolled by FPS, so much so that a dead body was found that you believe had been, was it 3 months?
Yes, ma'am, 3 months.
And it wasn't found by the FPS.
It was found by GSA because it was a vacant building that GSA was trying to sell, and GSA went into the building with a prospective buyer and apparently, maybe literally, stumbled on the body, but they're the ones who found it, not FPS.
Well, I just want to say for the record, I'd be the last one to say that you ought to patrol a vacant building the way you do other buildings, but your testimony seems to be that this is a building that would never have been patrolled.
That's correct, and it's my understanding that GSA was paying for that building.
GSA was paying for the building.
In terms of, its fees to FPS that included that building. That's our understanding.
One doesn't have to live in a big city to know that who vacant buildings draw. What kinds of squatters and even thugs and others are drawn to vacant buildings, so that while one wouldn't be patrolling them the same way you would a building where people were working, the notion of not patrolling them at all would be very, very troubling. And then you say it took a fire to get anybody to look at the building at all.
And it's an interesting add-on, ma'am, with that building, and this gets to the staff reduction problem. When FPS did respond to the dead body in this facility, they used their entire staff in the region to respond. They had so few people on patrol at the time that in responding to one incident like that, it took all the people they had.
Well, why? I mean, it's a dead body.
I'm not sure why. But it raises the staffing concerns. It raises the staffing concerns that we have, that it's so short-handed that when they have to respond
because
to
in order to
major,
respond to this building where they found a dead body, the FPS pulled people from where?
From the entire city. And so the other places that they protect in this particular city were unprotected.
That brings me to a question on management of the Federal Protective Service. If you have a dwindling number of police officers, is there the capability to manage the police part of the force at this point? Your testimony that you pull everybody from where there are live bodies to where there is one dead body leads me to that question. Who is, in fact, trying to manage such a small police force who has jurisdiction over so many federal facilities?
You raise a good point, because it's interesting. We look back at the record, and back in 1976, the Federal Protective Service had 5,000 police officers, no less the rest of their staff. And while we're not certainly advocating...
When?
1976.
Had...
5,000 police officers.
That's pure peace officers.
That's correct, as opposed to...
That was 5,000 and okay.
As opposed to the 215 today.
Now, are there more federal facilities today than there were in 1976?
Certainly.
Many more?
I don't know the actual number more, but there are.
In your final report,
we certainly
would you include the
absolutely
number of buildings where normally there would be FPS presence, and the increase since that time, we're going from 5,000 to 215, and if I may say so, post 9/11, and we're talking about the Department of Homeland Security. And they were transferred to this department because to enhance their role as a security force. The ironies roll out of this preliminary report, and we certainly did not want to be accused of sitting on it when we knew this much. We expect to hear more from you, but this is very troubling. I asked you about, there are two conversions going on here. The subcommittee hasn't generally opposed the use of security guards. We understand why some of the force necessarily would be security guards. We understand that they have less authority. And there's generally not been, on either side of the aisle, wholesale belief that nothing but police should be present. At the same time, we have recognized what the limitations of security guards are. And I would like you to spell out those limitations so that they are understood. What is it that a security guard can do? For example, one, to prevent crime, and two, in the event of a crime.
Sure. To prevent crime, they only have their own eyes and ears for the most part. Certainly they have guns. They do not have arrest or detention
Now, they have
authority
guns.
in
What
most
can they
places.
do with those guns?
Theoretically, they can use them. However, in every region that we went to, one of the major concerns that FPS officers and inspectors shared with us was an overriding concern of the limitations of their contract guard force, in that they believe and told us that contract guards are told by their firms that they should not get involved, that if incidents occur, that they should never use their firearm, they should never try to grapple with people, because the firms do not wish to encounter the liability. And
would
so
the
they
firms
feel...
be liable? Does the federal government not insure for contract guards or self-insure for contract guards?
I think that, I don't know the answer to that question. We will look into it. But the concern raised by the officials, virtually every person we talked to out in the field, was that they would not receive assistance from the contract guards in emergencies. And
so is this why the contract guards watched while somebody was stealing? Would you recount that incident again? You said that the contract guards witnessed some
right, even
crime.
more to the point is, in our testimony is the incident in which in a pretty major federal building, you had an inspector who was in the process of taking someone into custody who had an outstanding warrant. That person knew the building because they had been in it before. While the officer was arresting them, the individual had one wrist cuffed, got into a struggle with the guard. The police officer, the federal police officer, ended up ripping the guy's shirt off. The guy went running through the federal building, down through the main lobby, with the inspector following him. And
the inspector who was a peace officer.
Who was a peace officer following him, and 4 or 5 contract guards, all of whom are armed, standing in the lobby, stepped aside. The individual went flying through the front doors, automatic doors, went running down the street, and was only apprehended by another FPS officer who happened to be in a car about 2 blocks away. This occurred about 2 weeks ago. This is a rather recent incident. And so here was an incident in which the federal officers would ordinarily expect to rely on contract guards, but they were of no assistance.
Well, not only contract guards, and this is very troubling. It would be pathetic when you consider that citizens, when they see somebody running from the cops, will often try to stop them. When 5 different guards feel they shouldn't intervene, that says to me that they have an understanding, and that understanding is not only themselves, but it is not only among themselves and their own company, but that understanding must be the understanding of the Federal Protective Service as well. As the Protective Service bless this approach, that a security guard should stand aside when he sees someone fleeing from the police?
I can't answer that question specifically, but I can tell you that many of the people we talked to, many of the officers or inspectors, were very frustrated by this approach.
Could I ask that you ask the Federal Protective Service what it is that the Federal Protective Service believes that security guards should do in the event of incidents such as you describe, and whether the Federal Protective Service has said it is in keeping with the policy of the Federal Protective Service that the guards not intervene even when they see someone fleeing from obviously fleeing from an officer.
Yes, ma'am, we will. It's the other concern raised often is that even in doing their normal duties, they're not often adhering to post orders. And I must say that
what do you mean?
The orders that that govern how contract guards are supposed to operate at their fixed posts when people come into the building, or as we indicated early in our testimony, when a large surveillance trailer owned by a federal agency was stolen. It was very clear from the videotape that contract guards were observing through camera this trailer being stolen, but never did not go out to intervene, and also did not even report it.
What could the contract guard have done? What might the contract guard have done?
He could have gone out to try to stop the individuals from busting through the federal parking lot with this trailer. They could have and should have called either the Mega Center or the Federal Protective Service.
Well, why would they not have called? They didn't even call, you said.
No, ma'am. This was not, there was no report and no action taken until after the law enforcement agency that owned this trailer, which was worth about $500,000 because it was filled with sensitive surveillance materials. It was not for 3 days.
It was filled with what? I'm sorry.
It was filled with sensitive surveillance trailers. It was a law enforcement agency's trailer that was worth about $500,000, and it was roughly.
So this is a trailer that contained law enforcement information compiled by a law enforcement agency.
And what happened is someone backed a truck up to this trailer, hooked the trailer up. They tried to get out out of the gate. They tried to raise the gate of the parking lot. They could not raise the gate, so they simply drove through the gate. They busted the gate down, and this entire incident appears to have been watched, because there's video of the camera moving in and out and around as this occurred. But the contract guards never called the Federal Protective Service or the Mega Center or local law enforcement. And the only time they did anything, as far as we know, is about 3 or 4 days later, the law enforcement agency realized that its trailer was missing and started making inquiries. And only at that point.
You mean there had been no report until the agency that
lost that trailer
found it didn't have a trailer anymore?
That's correct.
And how long between the theft and the discovery?
It was within 3 or 4 days.
And we're talking about a great big trailer?
Yes, ma'am.
So even the so-called guard, let's assume that a guard, at least guards, if not policing guards, the guard function was not being
the guard was not following the orders that they had,
and what happened?
Not responding in the way they're supposed to.
That? The guard function was in fact also not being followed. What happened as a result?
We made an inquiry to determine what happened to that contract guard, and we were told that that contract guard was taken off of that post, but is still with that guard service, and he is at another federal facility monitoring in that facility.
What about I'm sorry, did you have?
I would just add, one of the concerns that officers regularly raise, as I was mentioning earlier, was that guards don't follow the orders that they have. Obviously, if someone's stealing a major piece of surveillance equipment, you're supposed to report it. We personally witnessed in entering one major federal building while we were doing our work, a breach. There was an individual directly in front of me who was carrying a large knife in a plastic bag into a major federal building. It was an illegal weapon. There are two categories, prohibited weapons and illegal weapons. This illegal weapon should have been taken from the individual. The individual should have been detained. The FPS should have been called, and further actions to understand what this individual was doing. All that the guard did was say, you can't bring that weapon in here, and kicked him out of the building. And of course, to let the guy either go around to another entrance or to do whatever he did. And so clearly was not, we saw that ourselves.
Does the training of guards occur in-house by the Federal Protective Service?
No, it's done by the contract guard companies.
So how does the Federal Protective Service know that it is getting trained guards?
There are certifications that it receives from the contract guard companies about the kind of training that they have
certifications done. What does that mean?
When guards go through their training program, the company will provide a statement, basically, that these individuals have received the requisite training.
In your judgment, did the guards seem to have received the requisite training?
We haven't done that work yet. That's part of the follow-on work that we will do. But there are a lot of concerns that were raised with us about the adequacy of training and the adequacy of firearms training as well. And we will look into all this in the next part of our work for you.
Now, you say that police officers are being told that there's no future for them here. Actually, we find in the federal service that there is lots of cross-recruitment of federal police officers, and that one of the difficulties is that I think that we have among the federal police is that you sometimes get people going because of some differences that it's hard to justify. And of course, last year there was some attempt to deal with that with, I think, the Library of Congress police and the police here, just to show you how ancient are some of these categories. But I'm wondering whether a federal police officer could just as easily try to find a job now at another federal police agency or police agency in the local jurisdiction, given the training that he may have received during the time when training was going on at a higher quality. Are these officers subject to leaving in any case because they are trained officers?
The attrition rate is quite high. For officers last year, it was 16%, and for inspectors, it was 11%. Many of the reasons.
How does that compare with attrition rates in either other federal police forces or in other federal work?
We will make that comparison when we do the remainder of this work. We have not done that part of the work yet, but we will get back to you on that.
What about these agencies which are being patrolled? What about these agencies that are being patrolled? The so-called clients of the FPS. Do they have a view as to whether they are being adequately protected? If you're a federal agency head or a federal agency manager at one level or another?
I think there's a couple of concerns. What they want most is a uniformed presence. They really want a federal police officer. They are very concerned.
The agencies.
The agencies. That's correct. They think that the contract guards, the tenants think that the contract guards, for the most part, do an adequate job in the responsibilities that they have, but they recognize that the kind of protection they're getting is deteriorating because of all the other issues that we've been talking about in terms of the countermeasures, the lack of local law enforcement, and the loss of the proactive patrols. They also have, in most cases, not been informed by the Federal Protective Service that this kind of shift is coming. In fact, we've met with more than 24 building security committees, which is the tenants in the various buildings. Most of them, the first time they had heard that FPS was moving to an inspector-based approach or that they were reducing hours was our discussion of that with them. So FPS...
So you're saying that FPS does not alert federal agencies about the differences in transformation in the workforce, a workforce that they have always understood to have uniformed officers guarding the buildings.
That's correct, or the impact that it might have on their agencies. I talked to one agency that has regular weekend hours in which the public comes into the building, and they were not aware that the Federal Protective Service was not patrolling that building on the weekends, and indicated that they would have to rethink whether they could keep the building open on the weekends, which would affect public access.
Well, we didn't ask you to review the morale of these officers and inspectors, because that's very, very difficult to evaluate. But what you described does lead me at this time to ask you, what about the feedback you're getting from the officers, from the inspectors? Is there anything you can generalize about how the workforce is viewing this change?
I think from our visits that we would have to say most of the workforce is demoralized. They don't have equipment, they have no career path, and many have been told to leave. They don't receive the training, the recognition, or the retirement of other law enforcement officials who do the same or similar work. The inspectors are overworked and overwhelmed. These are people who want to do a good job and are dedicated to protecting people and property from harm. And so they're having difficulty doing their job based on the kinds of challenges that we've mentioned, and the result is considerable attrition.
I mentioned in my opening statement my astonishment when we learned in hearing last year that there would be jurisdictions where there are federal facilities that would not be patrolled at all by Federal Protective Service. I wonder if there are such cities or other places in the United States where there is no Federal Protective Service presence, and if not, is there any presence, guard presence, or any semi-protection presence in the facilities where at the time we thought there would be as many as 50, where there is no Federal Protective Service presence?
There would be presence within each region, and so there would be officers and inspectors in a large geographic area that would respond to incidents. But there are major level 4 facilities in the United States.
Now, you need to describe a level
Sure.
4 facility is.
A level 4 facility is a facility that has at least 450 employees, has a large amount of square footage, and has thousands of people coming and going every day. The larger facilities,
This is almost the most secure facility.
That's correct, except for a few places in the United States. These are the most secure federal properties. There are level 4 facilities that have no round-the-clock or even regular federal protection. There may be contract guards, but we have found some of those facilities have drastically, I can think
They
of
do
one.
have contract guards?
They have some, but they've been greatly reduced. I know of one level 4 facility that went from 7 federal officers to 0 and from 30 contract guards to about 6. And this is a facility that sees just considerable traffic, both from the federal workforce and the public. And I'd rather not describe it any further, but it's at considerable risk.
So when we say no federal protective presence, does that mean on weekdays as well as weekends?
For facilities like the one I just described,
Like that level 4 facility?
That's correct. As I mentioned, there would be federal police officers in the region, somewhere else within that region that could respond, but they're not at that facility per se. But it could take hours for a federal officer to respond.
So in the event of an emergency, now talking about an emergency, where there are only contract guards, and here we're talking about contract guards at a number of level 4 facilities. The facility could be left with only contract guards and with no one able to respond in an emergency because, as you say, even if the Federal Police Service is chasing someone, the contract guards don't feel that they can respond to an emergency in the way that a police officer can. Is that the case? There will be no response, no immediate response from a police officer.
That is a possibility, yes.
In the event of an emergency.
That's a possibility. I'm aware of one incident recently at a pretty big federal building in which, as I understand it, part of the roof appeared as if it was going to fall onto the sidewalk, and tenants called to have the Federal Protective Service come and cordon off the area so that this thing would not fall and hurt someone. And it took an hour and a half for the Federal Protective Service to respond. A tenant stood outside, a building tenant, just a regular federal employee, stood outside for that period of time, warning people and pushing them away, but no federal law enforcement official, and apparently no local law enforcement official responded.
Were there contract guards there?
There were some contract guards. I don't know why the contract guards did not cordon the area off.
Can a contract guard do anything? You just described a citizen.
That's right.
Can a contract, who stepped in to do this, if a contract guard did what a citizen would do, would the contract guard imperil his company?
This is part of what we want to look into for the other job that we'll be doing for you. We need to get into these issues and find out exactly what not just their responsibilities are, but what the practical aspects of this are, because I suspect there are many similar instances.
This is very important for you to do. For example, and perhaps you can describe this, often we offhandedly talk about a citizen's arrest, that as a citizen I could go up to somebody and say, I'm going to hold you here until someone comes. Do you believe a contract guard could do that, or would contract guards do that given what you have seen?
We've not heard about those experiences in our review so far. We will look into that.
Have you any information on whether or not there are any MOUs with jurisdictions where we heard testimony that the substitute for the Federal Protective Service would be local police who would sign on to memorandum of understanding to provide or fill in the necessary security?
It's our understanding, based on discussions we had and all the site visits we went to, which has been since confirmed to us by the director of FPS, that there are no memorandums that have been signed to date. They have what are called mutual support agreements, which are not...
I'm sorry, would you say that again?
They have in place something that are called mutual support agreements, in which they simply have discussions by which they decide how to borrow each other's equipment, whether someone might use a canine dog, things like that, between local law enforcement and FPS. But there are no memorandums of agreement or understanding regarding the kinds of thing that FPS is talking about, in which local law enforcement would essentially take the place of FPS due to its downsizing and its reassignment to the inspector force.
That's what they were talking about. They were talking about you would then call local MPD here.
That's right. We, in fact, in our discussions, as I mentioned in my testimony, most of the police departments that we talked to indicated that they would not sign such an MOU for a variety of reasons, including liability to them, the fact that they're overwhelmed and wouldn't be able to respond anyhow, and that they believe it's the role of the federal government. We found that in one city that we went to, most of the police departments, in fact, were not even aware that FPS wanted them to take on these additional responsibilities, and were not aware that FPS was no longer working on weekends or had reduced hours or had shifted to a situation in which they weren't patrolling.
So not only did you find no MOUs, you found that in the cities where there might have been or were supposed to be MOUs, people hadn't even been contacted to sign an MOU.
Right. Essentially, there are, as we've looked at this work, there are 4 levels of protection. There's the Federal Protective Service itself, and that, as we say, has undergone significant change. There's the countermeasures, which increasingly appear to be broken. There are the contract guards, in which officers and inspectors have informed us there are significant problems about their performance. And then finally, the local law enforcement response, which appears, except for emergencies, to be something that would not work.
Has the contract guard workforce been relatively stable or increased, or has it been also diminishing?
It has increased considerably, from 5,000 in 2000 to 15,000 last year.
So it's a huge increase in contract guards who have no authority, according to your testimony, to do much more than watch.
Correct. And
the buildings.
And the number of inspectors who are required to oversee them have declined in that same time period.
They are essentially on their own then.
In many ways, yes, because as I indicated, because so many of the buildings that inspectors are required to watch are very far away from them. They may be hours away from their main post, and so they know contract guards are only going to get visited now and again, and they know they're not going to get visited on evenings and weekends because the FPS isn't working. And one region indicated to us that because the inspectors were so overwhelmed by the work they were doing, that regional management told them that they should do their check and their oversight of the contract guards by telephone.
By what?
By telephone.
I mentioned the liability question when it comes to contract guards, because after all, they're working for the federal government. It seemed to me that that could be worked out. I'd ask you to look at what I believe is a real problem for local police forces. That is to say, the jurisdictional boundaries of police forces, in fact, are very real. For example, even the federal police forces, one federal police force does not do what another does because of law and because of how the jurisdictional boundaries are laid out. Now, I believe there may well be federal law or something akin to that with respect to whether a local law enforcement agency on the basis of an MOU, where Congress, which has not been blessed by Congress, can simply go in and cross into a federal building, or for that matter, vice versa. For example, the Park Police is the only police force, the only federal police force in the District of Columbia that has citywide and region-wide jurisdiction. And it does have jurisdiction to arrest anywhere in the city or region. And that really comes from the fact that these massive federal parks are located in the region and in the District of Columbia. Rock Creek Park, for example, Anacostia Park, Fort DuPont Park. So Congress in its wisdom says these folks can't patrol without having unusual jurisdiction, so it's given it that jurisdiction. And so the notion that by MOU, an agency can go out and say, you now have jurisdiction to come in a federal building raises, in my mind, trained in the law, whether or not there was any authority to do that in the first place, and I wish you would look into that matter.
We plan to, ma'am, and I would add that this is one of the issues that is really perplexing the officers and inspectors, as well as the local law enforcement departments, because it is such an unclear situation where you have some facilities with exclusive federal jurisdiction and some with concurrent, that they don't know how to respond and what the chain of command would be. And they don't also, local law enforcement realizes that in many instances, even if they can go into a federal building, they need to be escorted by a federal officer. But the problem of the staff shortages is such that if an emergency is occurring, that
Excuse me, I didn't get that local have to be escorted.
Right. In many instances, the local law enforcement official would have to be escorted by a federal law enforcement official onto federal property. If there's an emergency and there's only, say, one FPS officer and they need assistance and backup, if they're going to use local law enforcement, they would have to be, the FPS would have to be present. The local law enforcement just wouldn't be able to go into the building on their own, is what we've been told so far. Obviously, we're going to look at this some more. But as I mentioned earlier, that FPS officer for that region may be 2 or 3 hours away.
It sounds like a patchwork that isn't even a patchwork. I'm trying to understand it. Now, the subcommittee and the full committee, the chairman, have been concerned about the absorption of FPS into ICE. How would you characterize the relationship between FPS and ICE, and perhaps compare it to its relationship when it was in GSA?
I can say that almost every single officer, inspector, and regional person we talked to out in the field indicated that the fit of FPS into ICE is poor.
That what?
The fit of FPS into ICE is very bad. They almost uniformly felt that FPS belonged in one of 3 places, either back at GSA, in the part of DHS which is called infrastructure protection, or as a standalone unit.
And why was that?
They believed that ICE does not pay them any attention. Almost everyone used the same kinds of words, that they were a stepchild of ICE, that ICE did not understand the role of FPS, and that as a result, they did not get the kind of budget and support.
Now, let's see this for a moment. What does ICE's mission is?
ICE's mission is immigration and customs enforcement.
No, so you got to make us understand why, since these are federal protective police, what led, putting yourself in the minds of DHS, what led them to put the FPS in ICE in the first place?
I can't answer that question right now, but it's something as we look into these issues, we will get back to you about the rationale of why it was placed in ICE and where it might better belong.
See, because the only thing I can, I'm trying, the first thing it seems to me to do when you try to figure something out is not to say they are crazy. They must have had a reason. And the only reason I can think of off the top of my head is Border Patrol is in there, and they patrol. So if you're only looking at labels, then these people patrol. So you put them in there. Now, why doesn't that work?
It's not working according to...
I mean, is Border Patrol a stepchild?
No, it's not. It's a much bigger entity. FPS is relatively small by comparison. FPS has not been allowed to have some of the same kinds of training and authorizations and access even to intelligence information that the rest of ICE and DHS has.
Now, what about being in infrastructure? Would you talk about why would that be a better fit? If they weren't in GSA, they were in another part of and you say it's called infrastructure and
infrastructure protection. We haven't looked at this yet. This is partly what we will do.
But your final report.
In the final report,
and
I'm just indicating.
The final report is due.
It's due at the end of May.
Go ahead.
What I'm sharing with you is the frustrations of the officers who believe it ought to be elsewhere, and they were indicating places where it would have a better fit. But almost uniformly, they believed it should not be in ICE.
Now, if you would let me know more about what infrastructure and protection does that makes them believe that they would be better suited if they were in DHS to be in that part.
The Infrastructure Protection Group specifically handles developing the plans to protect infrastructure of the nation. So that may be dams and nuclear facilities. It is federal buildings. It is a lot of different things. And from their view, they belong in that area better because part of what they're doing is trying to protect, bricks and mortar in the same way that the Infrastructure Protection Group is looking to protect bricks and mortar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was the thought that some of us had, but again, we didn't know what DHS's rationale, and it's very important. It'll be very important in your final report to know what their rationale was, whether DHS is capable of rethinking a rationale. I am sympathetic at one level to DHS. Here the Congress says, okay, here are, almost a dozen agencies. We slap them together, and then we say to DHS, okay, you figure out how they fit in. So it seems to me that it's not unlikely that here and there you'd make a mistake or so. That would concern me less than whether this agency is open to self-criticism, to looking at what it's done and correcting it, or whether it just digs in because that's where it is and that's what it's going to be. So I'd like to know what their rationale was in the beginning, and if that rationale continues to be, in their view, a valid rationale for where they have placed the agency given the continuing criticism.
Sure, we'll be happy to look into that as part of our review.
Yeah. Let me ask you about the funding source. Very interesting way we fund GSA. It worked pretty well. Would you describe how, fund the Federal Protective Service? Would you describe how the Federal Protective Service, what its funding source was when it was in GSA? And then would you describe how that works now that it's in DHS?
Sure. The Federal Protective Service when it was in GSA, received some funds from basic security fees that agencies paid, but it was never enough to cover the budget of the Federal Protective Service. And so GSA, most years, augmented their budget with money from the Federal Buildings Fund.
No. I'm sorry, would you
Sure.
say that again? When someone was talking to me and I didn't hear it.
Sure. In most years, they received money through their fees from tenants, but it's never been enough to cover.
The fees from tenants is a way of saying that if I am the Small Business Administration, I pay out of my budget for my police service.
That's correct. You'll pay a certain amount per square foot of space that you have from GSA.
And you say in your testimony that that amount per square foot has actually gone up.
That's correct. It's gone up by about 65% in the last couple of years.
Now,
It's never been enough to cover the
right.
costs, and so those have always been augmented in the past by money from the Federal Buildings Fund, by nearly $100 million, or some years more than that.
Where does the money from the Federal Buildings Fund come from?
It's a revolving fund that comes from GSA, appropriated by Congress.
Go ahead.
But since FPS left GSA, the Federal Buildings Fund has not been available to it. And so they've had that shortfall, which always existed, manifested itself in some pretty significant cuts.
So inevitably there was going to be a shortfall. Let us understand this. We have Federal Protective Service where Congress has found a kind of neat way to fund them by giving some responsibilities to the agencies. So the agency, out of its annual budget, acts like everybody else does. Donate something to fund them, and then, and I'd be interested in knowing what percentage, but then, of course, that was not going to be enough, and Congress kicked in. About what percentage came from these sources?
The Federal Buildings Fund made up, as I'm looking at this, looks like about a third. In 2000, the Federal Buildings Fund provided $95 million. In 2001, $90 million, $197 million in 2002.
This is okay, go ahead.
Right, and in 2003, $139 million. The last year in which it was in GSA, 2004, the Federal Buildings Fund provided $81 million. And then
when you say Federal Buildings Fund, you're talking about the federal government adding
to the funds that were being provided by tenants. And the very next year, 2005, is when you started running into issues. The shortfall in 2005 was $70 million, and the shortfall in 2006 was $57 million.
Source of funds, so you don't have the shortfall.
Now, the shortfall in funds came from the fact that it didn't come from the Federal Buildings Fund anymore?
That's correct. Fees at that point were not rising that much, and so you had this revenue.
So where did the money to cover the shortfall come from?
It came from a combination of from cost-cutting measures, which I indicated have had a detrimental effect in many ways, because those cost-cutting measures have eaten into training, into job-related travel, into equipment repairs like radios, into they haven't had new uniforms in years, or sometimes even cars. So it's had a detrimental effect on
on
the agency itself.
So does this mean that there is no regular way to in fact supplement what the agency itself pays as it was when FPS was in GSA?
They simply do not have the funds to cover the costs. That's correct, of providing it. They do not get enough money out of either the building-specific fees, the basic security fees, or the security work orders that they do to fund the agency. And so they've had to, in a number of years, in 2006, they had to institute $25 million in cost-cutting measures, and in 2007, they instituted $27 million of cost-cutting measures.
Well, is DHS authorized to augment the funds when you see this shortfall occurring?
In 2006, DHS reprogrammed $29 million to augment their budget in order to ensure that the agency wasn't anti-deficient.
Have they done it any of the years since then?
Well, does this mean that the ratio that was always understood and apparently worked in the past needs to be figured out for DHS as it was when the agency was in GSA? Are you telling me that this changes from year to year without any understanding about approximately how much is going to come from each funding source, who's going to pay for it?
I think without significant changes, they're going to be in this situation because they either have to raise fees to such an extent that the tenants are going to balk or find
that would
some
be
other
on the
funding
agencies
mechanism.
Out of their budgets.
That's right. Or you'll have to find some other mechanism of
And the other
funding.
mechanism before was
Was the buildings fund.
which was the revolving fund.
Correct.
The revolving fund always has some funds, and how does it get its funds?
It gets its funds mainly through tenant fees as well as Congress always kicked in additional money, but that money usually went towards specific construction projects.
Yes, and of course, the agencies pay rent, as it were.
That's right, and a portion of
into
that.
those funds. The agencies pay rent. That's how you get a buildings fund, yes, with some augmentation, and the agencies pay a fee for FPS. So at least there was some understood funding source, so that when you came to Congress, or if you came to Congress, and I don't think this was regularly necessary, but if you came to Congress and more money was done, there was some way to understand why there had been a shortfall. And I don't understand that there's a way to understand why there is a shortfall here, because it seems to me that when they don't have enough money, they simply cut even vital matters like equipment and cameras and the like.
That's correct. That's what they've been forced to do.
Mr. Goldstein, would you? I'm trying to get to the cause of this. Obviously, the Department of Homeland Security would not want to absorb a police force and then see it robbed of its police power, see it transformed from a police force. It thought it ought to be there because it was a police force. Obviously, it would not want to cut equipment. I wonder whether it would even desire, all things being considered, to convert the police force into basically an inspector force and leave the police work altogether. Would you say the reduction in equipment, the transformation to an inspector-based force, and the encouragement of officers to leave the agency all have essentially as their purpose to reduce costs and not a purpose that is related to security?
I think they
or
have.
Can you find a substantive reason for these radical changes in the police force for the protection of federal sites and workers?
I think it's twofold. I think they clearly want to transform FPS into a different kind of entity that is not reliant on police officers, in which they have a single kind of officer, the inspector, who can do a variety of different things.
Do you believe that it is possible for a police officer to do that variety of things, or that there ought to be some dedicated police officers?
Based on what we have heard to date, I would have to say that we feel that the approach they're taking does undermine security. Now, we recognize that they've had a number of budgetary consequences over the last couple of years, which have, in combination with this policy change, has aggravated the situation. But it's clear to us by talking with, the 200+ officers and inspectors we've talked to, that going to an all-inspector-based force will simply overwhelm them. These inspectors talked about not having the time to do all of their work, not even a fraction of their work, that they could spend virtually all their time just doing one part of that work. And so all of the functions they have tend to deteriorate as a result. So we don't see the evidence so far that this approach would work.
Mr. Goldstein, I'd also like to ask you to look in your final report into whether or not one would need to be a peace officer to do the inspection work. Peace officers are very highly paid in our society for a very good reason. Not just that they carry a gun, it is what we are asking them to do. And so police officers are usually paid better, have better pensions than other federal employees. Now we're talking about inspectors. As one, if FPS believes, if DHS believes it needs people to go around inspecting all the time, that may be a valid role. But I'd like you to look into whether or not they need to be peace officers, whether they need to have all that comes with being a peace officer. It's very substantial in order to be an inspector, so that Congress can decide whether or not this is the way to achieve what DHS wants to achieve, and whether it should be achieved by sacrificing the proactive patrolling and other work of the Federal Police Service as we've known them. Mr. Goldstein, I appreciate that you have done what the GAO does in unusual circumstances. It's much like what scientists do in a controlled study. When you're doing a controlled study and you find that the study is, for example, telling you that people should stop taking a medication, or I have seen, I remember maybe 10 years ago where there was a controlled study. I remember the Women's Caucus was delighted when there was a controlled study that found that some drug that was being taken, I don't know, to prevent breast cancer or some such, was unusually effective. So instead of waiting until the end of the control study, they alerted people what they had found. So they alert us on the negative end, they alert us on the positive end. So what the GAO has done here is in the tradition of the GAO, where you find something that perhaps should be brought to the attention of Congress before your final study is due, you bring it to our attention. You've done that in this case because you understood this involved the security of federal employees and visitors, and simply treating it as a report that tells us something that we needed to know might not be sufficient. For that, I want to thank you very much on behalf of the subcommittee and the committee, and to say that we very much look forward to receiving your final report.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your attention to the matter.
Hearing is adjourned.